"Mister, my baby needs medicine," Sarah Coleman whispered desperately to the pharmacist, her 6-month-old son burning with fever in her trembling arms as she stood in Henderson's drugstore on a bitter January morning in 1889. "We have no money left," she continued, her voice breaking with the shame that came from begging for charity in front of the entire town of Millbrook, Montana Territory. What happened next would either save her dying child or destroy what little hope remained in a community already devastated by the collapse of the silver mines that had once made their frontier town prosper. When the most hated man in Millbrook stepped forward to pay for medicine that could save a stranger's baby, his act of unexpected compassion would force an entire town to confront the difference between justice and mercy, between the past that defines us and the choices that can redeem us, proving that sometimes the people we judge most harshly are the ones capable of the greatest sacrifice when innocent lives hang in the balance. The winter of 1889 had been merciless to Millbrook, a once thriving mining town nestled in the Rocky Mountains where silver ore had promised prosperity but delivered only broken dreams when the veins ran dry and the eastern investors pulled their money out faster than a man could draw his gun. Main Street, which had once bustled with miners, merchants, and families building new lives on the frontier, now looked like a graveyard of abandoned businesses and boarded-up dreams. Half the buildings stood empty, their windows dark and their doors locked against a future that seemed to hold nothing but hardship and despair for the people who'd invested everything in Montana's silver boom. Sarah Coleman had been one of the fortunate ones, or so she thought when she married William Coleman, a hard-working miner who'd saved enough money to buy a small house and start a family with the woman he'd courted for 2 patient years. Their wedding in the spring of 1888 had been a celebration of hope and possibility, attended by friends who believed that love and determination could overcome any obstacle the frontier might throw at them. But by winter, the mine where William worked had closed permanently, leaving him without employment and his young family without income in a town where opportunities for work had disappeared along with the silver that had created them. Baby James Coleman had been born healthy and strong in July, a beautiful child with his mother's dark hair and his father's determined chin. But the harsh Montana winter had brought with it the pneumonia that was claiming children throughout the territory. Sarah had watched helplessly as her son's breathing became labored, his tiny body burning with fever that no amount of cool cloths or worried prayers seemed able to break. Dr. Morrison had been clear about the severity of the situation. Without proper medicine, the baby would likely die within days, joining the growing number of children who'd succumb to diseases that should have been treatable if their families could afford the remedies that remained frustratingly out of reach. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that medicine existed to save her son's life, sitting right there on the shelves of Henderson's drugstore, but might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her family. William had spent the last of their savings on food and coal to keep them warm through the winter, and Dr. Morrison required payment in advance for the expensive medicines that would need to be imported from Denver at considerable cost. The credit that might have been available during Millbrook's prosperous days had dried up along with the silver mines, leaving desperate families with no options except charity that most were too proud to accept. Standing in the drugstore with her dying baby, surrounded by neighbors who were struggling with their own financial disasters, Sarah felt the weight of complete helplessness crushing down on her like a cave-in at the mine. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, had offered what comfort she could, but sympathy wouldn't buy medicine. John Henderson, the pharmacist, was a good man who'd extended credit to many families during better times, but he too was struggling to keep his business afloat and couldn't afford to give away expensive medicines that represented his own family's survival. The other customers in the store that morning represented a cross-section of Millbrook's diminished population, farmers whose crops had failed during the drought that preceded the early winter, shopkeepers whose businesses were failing as customers disappeared, and the wives of unemployed miners who were making do with less of everything while trying to keep their families fed and healthy. They watched Sarah's desperation with the uncomfortable sympathy of people who understood exactly how quickly circumstances could change, how easily any of them could find themselves in her position begging for help they couldn't afford to provide. It was into this atmosphere of shared desperation and barely contained panic that Thomas Mitchell walked, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as one of the few people in Millbrook who'd actually profited from the town's economic collapse. Mitchell owned the First Bank of Millbrook, the institution that held mortgages on half the homes and businesses in town, and he'd become the focal point for community anger as more and more families lost their properties to foreclosure when they couldn't make payments on loans that had seemed manageable during the boom times. The silence that fell over the drugstore when Mitchell entered was thick with hostility and resentment, the kind of tension that preceded violence in frontier towns where justice was often determined by whoever could draw fastest or hit hardest. Sarah felt the baby trembling in her arms, his fever spiking higher as precious minutes ticked away while she stood frozen between her desperate need for help and her awareness that she was about to become the center of a confrontation that could turn deadly without warning. Thomas Mitchell was 42 years old, a man who'd built his bank from nothing through careful investments and shrewd business decisions that had made him wealthy while others struggled to survive. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray that suggested the weight of responsibilities most people never had to carry, and his pale blue eyes held depths that hinted at experiences he kept carefully hidden from public view. Everything about his appearance suggested success and prosperity, but those who looked closely might have noticed the haunted quality in his expression that spoke of losses that money couldn't replace. Thomas Mitchell surveyed the tense scene in Henderson's drugstore with the calculating gaze of a man who'd learned to read people's intentions through 20 years of frontier banking. But what he saw in Sarah Coleman's desperate face struck him with unexpected force. The young mother's anguish was raw and immediate, her baby's labored breathing audible in the hostile silence that had fallen over the store when he'd entered. Mitchell had spent months being the target of community hatred, blamed for foreclosures that were actually the inevitable result of economic forces beyond anyone's control. But seeing this woman's helpless terror over her dying child awakened something in him that he thought was buried forever beneath years of necessary business decisions. "How much does the medicine cost?" Mitchell asked Henderson quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. The pharmacist glanced nervously between Mitchell and the other customers, clearly uncomfortable about conducting business with the man most of them held responsible for their financial ruin. The baby's weak cries filled the silence as Sarah clutched him closer, her green eyes wide with the kind of desperate hope that came from watching death approach and grasping at any possibility of salvation. $15 for the full course of treatment, Henderson replied reluctantly, naming a sum that represented more money than most families in Millbrook saw in 3 months of careful budgeting. Plus another $10 for Dr. Morrison's consultation fees, and that's assuming the child responds well to the initial treatment. The pharmacist's tone suggested he didn't expect anyone present to have that kind of money available, particularly not for a baby whose parents were obviously among the town's growing population of destitute families. The hostile murmur that rippled through the assembled customers reflected their bitter resentment at hearing such sums discussed casually while their own children went without basic necessities. James Fletcher, whose farm had been foreclosed by Mitchell's bank just 2 months earlier, stepped forward with the kind of aggressive posture that suggested violence might be only moments away. "Easy for you to ask about prices, Mitchell, when you're the one with blood money in your pockets from stealing decent folks' homes and livelihoods." "That's enough, Fletcher," Dr. Morrison said sharply as he entered the store, having been summoned by Mrs. Henderson when the baby's condition worsened. The doctor was one of the few people in Millbrook who maintained neutrality in the community's conflicts, focusing on medical needs rather than financial politics. But even his calm authority couldn't completely diffuse the tension surrounding Mitchell's presence. "This child needs immediate treatment, not political arguments. Every minute we waste arguing could be the difference between life and death." Sarah found herself caught between her desperate need for help and her awareness that accepting assistance from Thomas Mitchell would mark her family as collaborators with the man who destroyed so many of their neighbors' lives. Her husband William had been among the loudest voices condemning Mitchell's foreclosure policies, arguing that a decent banker would find ways to help struggling families rather than seizing their properties at the first sign of financial difficulty. But her baby was dying, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when her child's life hung in the balance. "Mrs. Coleman," Mitchell said gently, addressing her directly for the first time, "your son needs that medicine now. Don't let him suffer because of what people think about me." His voice carried something that sounded remarkably like genuine compassion, though Sarah couldn't understand why the man who'd shown no mercy to foreclosed families would suddenly care about her baby's welfare. The other customers watched this exchange with growing anger, interpreting Mitchell's offer as either manipulation or an attempt to buy forgiveness for his past actions. Thomas Mitchell reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet that contained more cash than most people in Millbrook had seen in years, counting out $25 with the same careful precision he brought to all his business transactions. The sight of so much money being handled casually while their own families struggled with poverty inflamed the other customers' resentment. But Mitchell seemed oblivious to their hostility as he placed the bills on Henderson's counter with quiet determination. "This should cover the medicine and Dr. Morrison's fees," Mitchell said simply, making no attempt to explain his motivations or seek recognition for his generosity. "Whatever's left over can go toward future medical expenses if the child needs additional treatment." The matter-of-fact way he handled the transaction suggested this wasn't an impulse decision but something he'd considered carefully despite knowing it would increase the community's hostility toward him. Sarah stared at the money on the counter as if it were something miraculous, hardly daring to believe that salvation for her baby had appeared from such an unexpected source. Her hands trembled as Dr. Morrison took the child to examine him more thoroughly, confirming that immediate treatment could indeed save his life if they acted quickly. The medicine that had seemed impossibly out of reach moments earlier was now within her grasp, provided by the man her community considered their greatest enemy. "Why?" Sarah whispered, looking at Mitchell with confusion and desperate gratitude. "Why would you help us when everyone in town blames you for their troubles? What do you want from us in return?" Her questions reflected the suspicion that most frontier people had learned to maintain about unexpected generosity, particularly from sources they had reason to distrust. Nothing in life came free, especially not from bankers who'd built their fortunes on other people's misfortune. Mitchell's pale blue eyes met hers with an intensity that suggested depths of pain and experience that he kept carefully hidden from public view. "I don't want anything from you, Mrs. Coleman. Sometimes helping someone is its own reward, regardless of what other people think about your motivations." His answer was deliberately vague, offering no real explanation for his unexpected compassion, but there was something in his voice that suggested personal experience with the kind of loss she was facing. The news of Thomas Mitchell's unexpected generosity spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire on dry prairie grass, sparking heated debates in every home, business, and gathering place as the community struggled to understand why their most reviled citizen had suddenly spent his own money to save a stranger's baby. Sarah Coleman found herself at the center of a moral storm that divided neighbors and friends, with some praising her for accepting help regardless of its source while others condemned her for taking what they called blood money from the man who destroyed so many families. The baby's medicine was working, his fever breaking after 2 days of treatment, but Sarah discovered that Mitchell's act of charity had created complications she'd never anticipated. William Coleman returned from his fruitless job search in Helena to find his wife caring for a recovering child whose life had been saved by the man he'd publicly called a heartless destroyer of families and communities. The internal conflict that tore at William was visible in every line of his withered face as he struggled between gratitude for his son's survival and shame at being indebted to someone he'd considered an enemy. The other unemployed miners looked at him with expressions ranging from understanding to disgust, unable to decide whether he was lucky or cursed to have received help from such a controversial source. "I don't understand it any more than you do," Sarah told her husband as they sat beside baby James's crib, watching their son sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. "Mitchell didn't ask for anything in return, didn't even want to be thanked. He just paid for the medicine and walked away like it was the most natural thing in the world." The mystery of Mitchell's motivations had haunted Sarah since that morning in the drugstore, leaving her with questions that seemed to have no logical answers. Dr. Morrison, making his follow-up visit to check on the baby's progress, confirmed what they all could see. James was going to make a full recovery thanks to the prompt medical intervention that Mitchell's money had made possible. "Without that medicine, you would have lost him within days," the doctor told them bluntly, his professional honesty cutting through any attempt to minimize what Mitchell had done for their family. "Whatever you think about the man's business practices, he saved your child's life." The community's reaction to Mitchell's generosity revealed the complex nature of frontier justice and the difficulty of reconciling past grievances with present realities. James Fletcher, whose farm Mitchell's bank had foreclosed, confronted Sarah outside the general store with accusations that she was legitimizing the banker's ruthless business practices by accepting his charity. "You're making it easier for him to sleep at night after destroying decent families," Fletcher argued, his anger reflecting the frustration of someone who'd lost everything and needed someone to blame. But Martha Henderson, the pharmacist's wife whose own family had been helped by Mitchell's quiet generosity over the years, defended Sarah's decision with equal passion. "A dying baby doesn't care about politics or past grievances," she declared firmly. "Any mother would have done exactly what Sarah did, and anyone who says otherwise has never watched their child struggle for every breath." The women of Millbrook found themselves particularly divided on the issue, torn between their loyalty to the community's collective anger and their understanding of maternal desperation. Thomas Mitchell himself seemed unaware of the controversy his actions had created, continuing his daily routines with the same quiet determination that had characterized his behavior since arriving in Millbrook 5 years earlier. He conducted bank business with professional efficiency, maintained his modest home with meticulous care, and attended church services where he sat alone in the back pew while other congregants whispered about his motivations for helping the Coleman family. His apparent indifference to public opinion only fueled more speculation about his true character and hidden agenda. Sarah began to notice details about Mitchell that she'd overlooked during the years when community prejudice had shaped her opinions of him. He was always impeccably dressed but never ostentatious, wealthy but not wasteful, authoritative but not arrogant in his business dealings. More intriguingly, she observed that he paid special attention to families with young children, his expression softening whenever he encountered mothers with babies or watched children playing in the street. There was something in his eyes during these moments that suggested personal experience with loss that went deeper than mere business disappointments. The breakthrough in understanding Mitchell's character came when Sarah discovered him standing outside the cemetery on a cold February morning, his head bowed before a small grave that most people in town had forgotten. The headstone was simple and weathered, marking the resting place of baby Mitchell, born and died March 1884, too beautiful for earth. Sarah watched from a distance as this powerful man who commanded fear and respect throughout the territory knelt beside the tiny grave with the broken posture of someone carrying unbearable grief. He was 6 months old, Mitchell said quietly, apparently sensing her presence without turning around. Same age as your James when the pneumonia took him. I was working in a silver camp outside Denver, barely making enough to feed myself, let alone pay for medicine when he got sick. His voice carried the flat tone of someone recounting facts too painful for emotional expression, but Sarah could hear the weight of years of guilt and regret underlying his careful control. I promised myself that if I ever had the power to save another child from dying the way my son died, I'd do it regardless of what anyone thought about my motivations, Mitchell continued, finally standing to face Sarah with eyes that held depths of pain she was only beginning to understand. Money can't bring back the dead, Mrs. Coleman, but sometimes it can prevent other families from experiencing the same loss that destroyed mine. The revelation of Thomas Mitchell's tragic past spread through Millbrook like a gentle rain after drought, washing away years of accumulated resentment and replacing bitter judgment with reluctant understanding as the community finally grasped the true motivation behind his unexpected act of charity. Sarah Coleman found herself becoming an inadvertent bridge between the man who'd saved her son's life and the neighbors who'd spent years condemning him, sharing Mitchell's story with a discretion that honored his privacy while helping others understand that his business decisions had been shaped by grief rather than greed. The transformation wasn't immediate or universal, but gradually the people of Millbrook began to see their banker as a fellow human being carrying unbearable loss rather than a heartless enemy profiting from their misfortune. James Fletcher was among the first to approach Mitchell directly, swallowing his pride to seek a conversation with the man whose bank had foreclosed on his farm just months earlier. The meeting took place on a quiet Sunday morning outside the church, where both men had been attending services while carefully avoiding each other for years. Fletcher's withered face showed the internal struggle of someone forced to reconsider deeply held beliefs about justice and forgiveness, but his handshake was firm when he offered it to Mitchell with genuine respect. I owe you an apology, Fletcher said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man acknowledging his own mistakes. I blamed you for decisions that probably weren't any easier for you to make than they were for me to accept. Losing the farm nearly destroyed my family, but losing a child. He paused, unable to complete the thought but understanding finally why Mitchell had seemed so unmoved by personal appeals during foreclosure proceedings. A man already carrying the ultimate loss couldn't be swayed by threats of lesser tragedies. Mitchell's response was characteristically reserved but tinged with something that might have been relief at finally being understood rather than simply feared or hated. Your anger was justified, Fletcher. I took your home when you couldn't make payments, and that hurt your family regardless of my reasons for following bank policy. I'm sorry that circumstances forced me to make those decisions, but I won't pretend they didn't cause real harm to people who deserved better. The admission of responsibility without defensiveness marked a turning point in their relationship and set an example for how healing might begin throughout the community. Dr. Morrison, who'd observed Mitchell's behavior more closely than most during his frequent visits to treat the Coleman baby, began sharing his own insights about the banker's character with other influential community members. I've watched Thomas Mitchell interact with dozens of families over the years, the doctor told Judge Harrison during one of their regular chess games. He's never once shown satisfaction when foreclosing on property, and I've seen him personally drive families to the train station with money for travel expenses when they lost their homes. That's not the behavior of a man who enjoys others' suffering. As winter gave way to spring and baby James grew stronger under his mother's devoted care, the broader implications of Mitchell's generosity became apparent throughout Millbrook. Other struggling families found that the banker had quietly modified loan terms to prevent additional foreclosures, accepting reduced payments rather than seizing properties during the continued economic hardship. The revelation that he'd been working behind the scenes to help people stay in their homes contradicted everything the community had believed about his character and motivations. Sarah Coleman made a point of bringing baby James to the bank regularly, not for business but simply to let Mitchell see the healthy, thriving child whose life his money had saved. These visits became a source of quiet joy for the reserved banker, who would emerge from his office to spend a few minutes watching James crawl around the floor or listening to Sarah's updates about his developmental milestones. The sight of Mitchell's face softening as he interacted with the baby helped other customers understand that beneath his professional reserve was a man who genuinely cared about the community's welfare. The most significant change came when Mitchell announced that the bank would be implementing new policies designed to help families with their financial difficulties rather than simply punishing them for circumstances beyond their control. Working with Dr. Morrison and Judge Harrison, he established a community fund that would provide emergency assistance for medical expenses, ensuring that no other family would have to choose between bankruptcy and their children's health. The fund was quietly supplemented by Mitchell's personal contributions, though he insisted on anonymity for his donations. Summer brought prosperity back to Millbrook as new mining claims opened in the surrounding mountains, but the lessons learned during the harsh winter had permanently changed the community's character. Mitchell found himself welcomed into social gatherings for the first time since arriving in town, no longer the isolated figure who conducted business from behind emotional walls. His gradual integration into community life revealed a man with surprising depth, intelligence, and dry humor that had been hidden beneath years of protective reserve. The annual Independence Day celebration that July marked a symbolic moment of reconciliation as Mitchell agreed to serve on the organizing committee alongside several families whose properties his bank had once foreclosed. Working together to plan festivities for the entire community required cooperation and trust that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. But the shared experience of overcoming hardship had created bonds stronger than past grievances. Baby James Coleman, now walking and babbling with the exuberant energy of a healthy toddler, became an unofficial mascot for the community's renewal. His presence at public gatherings served as a living reminder that compassion and sacrifice could triumph over bitterness and despair, that even the most unlikely people were capable of heroic acts when innocent lives hung in the balance. Mitchell never claimed credit for the child's recovery, but everyone understood that James's laughter and joy existed because one man had chosen mercy over self-protection. As autumn returned to Millbrook, bringing with it the anniversary of that desperate morning in Henderson's drugstore, Sarah Coleman organized a community dinner to celebrate not just her son's life but the lessons his near-death had taught them all about the complexity of human nature and the possibility of redemption. The gathering brought together families who'd spent years avoiding each other, united now by their shared understanding that survival on the frontier required looking beyond surface appearances to find the humanity in every neighbor. Thomas Mitchell sat at the head table not as a guest of honor but as a member of the community who'd finally found his place among people who understood that everyone carried hidden burdens and secret sorrows. When Judge Harrison offered a toast to second chances and the courage to see beyond our prejudices, Mitchell's eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. Surrounded by friends who'd learned to value character over reputation and compassion over rigid justice, the speech that followed was brief but profound, as Mitchell thanked the community not for accepting his past actions but for allowing him to become the man his son's memory had challenged him to be. James Coleman will grow up in a town where people help each other not because it's expected but because it's right, he said quietly. That's the legacy I want to leave, and the promise I make to every child in this community who deserves better than the broken world we sometimes create through our fears and judgment. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of frontier communities during the economic hardships of the late 1880s, Millbrook would be remembered as an example of how crisis could reveal the best in human nature rather than just the worst. The story of a hated banker who saved a dying baby became part of local legend, passed down through generations as proof that redemption was always possible for those willing to choose love over fear, mercy over judgment, and hope over despair. This powerful story of redemption, sacrifice, and second chances reminds us that the people we judge most harshly often carry the deepest wounds and are capable of the greatest acts of love when innocent lives are at stake. If Thomas Mitchell's journey from community outcast to beloved neighbor moved your heart, Please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell because everyone needs to hear stories that show us how compassion can transform not just individuals but entire communities. Share this incredible tale of unexpected heroism with someone who needs to remember that we all carry hidden pain and deserve second chances to become better than our worst mistakes. Tell me in the comments which moment touched you most deeply: Mitchell's silent sacrifice in the drugstore, the revelation of his tragic past, or the community's beautiful transformation from judgment to understanding. Your engagement helps these life-changing stories reach others who desperately need hope and inspiration. What story of redemption and community healing should we explore next? Remember, you never know the full story behind someone's actions, and sometimes the most broken people are the ones capable of the most beautiful acts of love.